Lights out.
Come on, Bobby, how come I always have to do it? Clyde Arnott could hear the weight that his brother put against the pause button on the controller of his NES. The controller made that click sound that was somewhere between breaking and annoyed. It was the sound that let Clyde know that Bobby was just about done with his whining and would stop talking and start shouting. Bobby, for the most part, been trying to be patient lately. He was dating some girl who was really into good Christian values and just being kind to people. Bobby was really trying to follow her example, but Clyde was apparently really good at pushing his buttons because, oh brother of mine, you need to toughen up or this world is going to eat you alive. Clyde felt a sudden burst of fear. Being eaten alive was exactly why he was afraid to go downstairs and do what needed to be done. Bobby laughed, not literally. Kiddo, I mean like if kids at school learn that my 12-year-old brother is still afraid of the dark, they'd never let him live it down. He'd be a social outcast. Unwelcome anywhere. I leave the job of turning off all the lights to you for that very reason. Clyde looked at the open door as if he could already feel the eyes of the thing that hunted him and despaired. The house they lived in had been his mother's childhood home. She had lived here with her two older sisters until she went off to follow their dad when he joined the Navy a year before. Bobby had been born when Grandma had died suddenly, Dad having beat her into the grave. By 6 months after a motorcycle accident, she had generously left the house to whichever daughter wanted it. His aunts had their own homes by that point, and the 2-story home, free and clear with no liens on it, had seemed like a dream. The first night they had been alone in the house, their mother having to work late most nights, she told them that before they went to bed, she expected all the lights to be off downstairs. I won't have my power bill up over the roof because you guys are trying to light the whole neighborhood. Clyde had been assigned the task of turning off the lights before bed since that very night. This task had been handed down by Bobby almost at once. He got away with this because A, he was the oldest, and B, because Mom worked 5 to 6 nights a week to pay 4 bills and taxes on the property. This meant that most nights it was just the two of them in the house, and Bobby was in charge when it was just the two of them. As such, Bobby usually gave Clyde the chores he didn't want, and that included turning off the lights. Come on, Bobby, Clyde tried again, but his brother wouldn't budge. Don't start, kid, you need to get over this, and the only way to do it is to do it, know what I mean? Clyde didn't, but he nodded anyway. He took the stairs like a palsied old man, watching as the downstairs got closer and closer. As he came to the landing, he switched the light off beside the stairs and began. The lights, as it turned out, had to be turned off in a certain order. If you didn't turn off the stair lights first and the lights by the basement last, they would all come back on again. Neither of them understood why, but Clyde attributed it to the thing that lived in the dark after the lights went out. He had named it Mr. V for some reason, and even he didn't know why. He supposed he had to call it something, and that was as good a name for his nemesis as any. Bobby just thought it was some faulty wiring and told him that if he meant to get the job done, then that's how it would have to be. You could leave the stair light on the ones on the stairs. In fact, it was advised so you could find your way back sometimes. It was the best way to find your way back from the depths, and Clyde had used that light as a lighthouse more than once. He went into the foyer and turned the lights off, went to the mudroom and turned the lights off, but made sure to leave the porch light on so Mom could find the lock when she got home. Mr. V didn't care about the porch light, it seemed, and that was good because Mr. V could have a temper when he wanted to. The first couple of nights Bobby had gone with him. As long as Bobby was with him, nothing ever seemed to happen. The two went room to room before walking casually back to the stairs and up to their rooms. Whatever Mr. V was, he didn't bother big kids. Or maybe it was just kids who didn't believe in him. Clyde didn't know, but it was always different when he was by himself. He turned the lights off in the dining room, slowly finishing with the switch by the door so he could turn his back on the room. Walk out. This was part of the game too, and it seemed to make it better if whatever it was didn't see you seeing it. Sometimes the dining room would be empty when he turned the light off, but sometimes he would see a figure standing in the dark space. When he was done, sometimes it was standing behind the chair at the head of the table. Sometimes It was standing by the window, but it was always looking at him. It was never close like the horror movies he and Bobby sometimes watched when Mom worked late. It was never just right in front of him, ready to grab him when the lights went off, but it was still closer than he would have liked. As he walked towards the living room, he could almost feel the eyes of Mr. V on his neck, and it made him shudder. Clyde looked at the leather couch that his mother had brought from the apartment, her only addition to her mother's furniture, and felt a pang of guilt as he looked at the scratches across the leather. That hadn't been his fault, not really, that he had caused it. The pastor at church said that people had to take accountability for their actions, and Clyde was man enough to admit that this had been his fault. He had broken the rules, and he had to pay the price. It had all started very subtly. He would notice little things once the lights went out, and he would make note of them for later. The shadow man was one thing he thought of as Mr. V. Then there was the way the shadows lengthened and twisted sometimes when the lights were off. The whole downstairs took on a kind of puffy, unreal look after dark, and he had seen it swell or shrink depending on its wants. He still wasn't really afraid of Mr. V. Still did really believe in him, but he was afraid of the dark, and that made it easy to tell yourself that anything could be living in it. Even this mysterious Mr. V. He had spent weeks running up the stairs as he fled the kitchen for the living room. He had never felt anything grab at his ankles or claw at his shirt, but it had always felt like a close thing. The week before the incident had been a bad one. It felt a sense of foreboding hanging over the dark rooms, and it was making its way into his dreams. Sometimes when he dreamed, he would run through endless corridors, the shadow man chasing him. He fled. It was weird to be on the cusp of 11 and feel like you might be on the verge of having a breakdown, but Clyde was getting there. He had tried to explain it to his mom, but she just said that Bobby was in charge, and it sounded like he was trying to help him. Bobby was relentless when it came to ridding his brother of his fear of the dark. He told him how the other kids would pick on him as he went into middle school with his fear, how no one would want to be his friend, and that hadn't helped his anxiety either. That night when he'd come downstairs, Bobby was already asleep, and Clyde really didn't want to turn off the lights alone. He had turned off the lights in the foyer with a shaky hand, but then he had seen the shadow man, Mr. V, lurking by the front door, and his legs had started to shake. The man was looking at him, staring into him with his non-existent eyes, and as he watched, Clyde realized he was backing up. He was slowly backing up, making his way towards the stairs. When he dashed up them, he closed the door to his room and locked the knob. He climbed into bed and covered up, closing his eyes tight as he heard something terrible happening downstairs. Crashing, bashing, furniture being turned over, and all of it because he had been too scared to turn off the lights. His mother had woken them up when she got in, yelling for them to get downstairs. Clyde had still been awake and had suspected what they would find. "What the hell did you guys do? All the lights are on, the house is destroyed. I want some answers." As the two looked over the destruction, they saw she wasn't wrong. Neither of them could come up with a good enough explanation, and their mother had set them to clean it up as she got ready for bed. The house looked like a tornado had been through it. Books were thrown off shelves, the couch was cut and ripped, the end table was turned over, and the whole room was just an unholy mess. Bobby had complained about it, even cornering his brother after Mom had gone to bed and asking him why he had trashed the house. He hadn't been awake to hear the destruction, but Clyde had. He knew he hadn't done this, and he knew Bobby hadn't done it, so unless his mom had come home early to trash the house, it had to be Mr. V. After that, Clyde had been more diligent about getting the lights off, and as long as he pretended not to see Mr. V, he never bothered him. He shut the lights off in the living room, now the mended / lost in the dark, and headed for the kitchen. The dishes were in the drying rack, the sink gleaming after Bobby had wiped it out, and the chairs were all pushed in around the table. Clyde turned to look, marking his escape route in his mind, as he prepared to make a run for it, and shuddered as he saw the dark head peeking out from the door to the den. It was waiting for him to turn the lights off, and when his hand shook as his finger hovered over the switch, Clyde hoped he had the strength to do it again. He pulled it down and immediately took off. He heard something come out of the den, but he was already running through the door to the living room. He bumped something with his hip, as he passed by the couch, slowing him a little. As he made for the stairs, it wasn't the first time he had bumped something, but it wasn't the pain that had slowed him. The side of the china cabinet had felt like Play-Doh, not quite solid, and it only reminded him that once the lights were out it was different down here. When the lights were on, this was where he and Bobby sat and watched cartoons or MTV after school. When the lights were on, this was where he and his mom sat on the couch on Sundays and watched Lifetime. When the lights were off, however, the landscape was something else, a place that he had no control over. He could see the stairs, the light casting long fingers down into the dark, but as he got close, his greatest fear was realized. Until then, he could tell himself that it was all in his head. He could tell himself that this was just his imagination playing tricks on him and that it would pass. Once he was Bobby's age, Clyde could come up with 1,000 excuses for his fear. When he was safe in his bed and the monster was downstairs. But as something grabbed his leg, Clyde knew that the excuses were nothing but a paper shield. The thing that grabbed his leg wasn't a hole beneath the couch or a toy that had been left out. The grip was iron, the claws were sharp, and when he turned back to look, Clyde wished he hadn't. The sight of that pitch-black face undulating in the semi-darkness of his living room was the most terrifying thing he had ever seen. The mouth was full of gnashing teeth. The eyes were like spiral circles drawn by an uncreative child, and Clyde screamed in terror as he kicked at the thing with his free leg. It took the first kick between the eyes, but the second made the grip loosen some, and the third finally found him able to yank his leg free. He felt the claws scratch across his flesh, leaving 4 long marks, but Clyde didn't care. Clyde was running up the stairs on all fours, and when he came to the top, he looked down and saw the thing sitting at the bottom of the stairs. Looking at him, it didn't seem to care that it hadn't caught him. It didn't seem to care that he had escaped. The look in those black-on-black eyes let him know that eventually it would get him. Tomorrow was another day. What happened? Clyde turned coward as a new figure rose up from the dark hallway. He screamed again. Sure, he was about to die, and Clyde almost cried when he heard a familiar voice. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Bobby asked. Clyde tried to tell him, but he couldn't properly articulate what he had experienced. It remained one of the scariest events in his life. "I survived an exorcism. What they tell you are lies. Have you ever hated someone truly? Hated someone? Do you know what it's like to be swallowed by anger, to fantasize and wish the worst possible punishments on another living being over and over and over again if you have him? Sorry. 2 years ago, my son was taken from me. He was the light of my life. I remember even now how tightly he held my thumb in his little hand when I first held him. His first steps as he walked into my arms from across the kitchen with those big brown eyes and that heart-melting smile. He used to drool on my chest when he slept, and even though he ruined every shirt I had, as I watched his little chest rise and fall, I loved him more than I ever thought possible. His mother, Elizabeth, my Lizzie, was over the moon when she saw him. If you think I loved him, you should have seen her. There's nothing in the world stronger or more beautiful than a mother's love. We named him Daniel after Lizzie's father. You should have seen how he cried when we told him. It was that first year hit us harder than most. You underestimate how much money it takes to raise another person, and when doctor visits and babysitting fees start to stack up, you realize just how expensive existing is. On top of bills and necessities, Lizzie had a tough time recovering. Postpartum depression swallowed her whole. It's the stillness, the complete absence of light in a loved one's eyes as they fight that mental hell that kills you. It's knowing that they're right there, and yet a whole world away, suffering silently. It's the quiet blaming on yourself for any little thing you do that you think threw them there. It's the slow resentment that builds and the guilt that eats at you because you know deep down it's not their fault. Lizzie was the strongest person I'd ever known, and although she would peek out from then on, she never fully recovered. She was thrown in a hole too deep and too dark to climb out of, so she tried as best she could to live in that darkness and make that hole her new normal. When her maternity leave ended, we had to leave him in daycare. We were nervous wrecks without him. I couldn't exactly keep him with me while I worked construction on the sites. And I doubt Lizzie's bosses would have been thrilled to have him manning the front desk with her. Although it would have been adorable, Danny was a trooper, friendliest little boy alive. Although he couldn't talk too well, he was more than happy to tell us all about his adventures. Stomping around town on daycare trips, he loved the park, especially after he was done on the playground. He'd feed the ducks and then sit to eat right there with them. He even made us pack a separate lunch just for his favorite duck on park days. Danny loved that park. I think he knew that too. I think that's why he let us find him there. I had gotten the call around lunchtime that he was missing. I had called Lizzie and she nearly had a breakdown on the phone. My supervisor tried stopping me, but when I explained to him what had happened, he let me go. I found out later that he had got together a few of the guys to help with the search party. It was 16 long hours before we got the news. The police had found him stuffed in a ditch hidden behind the pond. They had to call in animal services to help retrieve the body. The problem was that whenever someone got too close, the ducks would charge to protect him. We couldn't bury him until half a week later, once his body was no longer deemed evidence. Lizzie followed shortly after. When they got the guy I pushed for the death penalty, the coroners had said it was as if his body had been scrubbed clean before he was dumped. The lack of sufficient DNA evidence to charge him with anything else, coupled with the fact he was a first-time offender, meant the best we could get was 25 to life. I was beyond anger. He'd get to spend the rest of his miserable life being pampered in a cell, being fed 3 meals a day, while I had to pick up the pieces as I buried my wife and child. I had begged God for justice for that son of a bitch, to get what he deserved, but justice never came. When I heard he was out on bond, I became obsessed. I felt myself going mad every day. That bastard was allowed to breathe another lungful of air, even though I was still living and breathing. He killed us both the day he took my Daniel. I died the night I picked my son up out of that hole. If he were a piece of trash tossed into the bushes. When the lawyers turned their backs on me, I decided to take matters into my own hands. The criminal justice system was nothing more than a circus act, and I was a monkey dancing to its beat. I took what little I had left over from the lawyer fees and bought a revolver and box of bullets. I only needed one for him and one for me. The night before I did it, I went to church one last time. Drunker than I'd ever been, I walked into that warmly lit temple and let the Lord have it. I had prayed for his death day after day, week after week, but every time I did, God failed to deliver. As I sat on that pew and sipped that bottle dry, I told him that if he couldn't deliver me peace, then I'd find it from the devil. As I drunkenly trudged through that cold night, bitter and angry, I heard it. I heard the voice of a woman calling my name. I looked around, but I couldn't spot anyone. Still, I heard it clear as day. It followed me every step of the way home, and that night she visited me. I had been having the same nightmare over and over again since it had happened. Reliving that stomach-turning moment, I walked across those bushes to find my little boy face down in the mud. That night, however, was different. That night, I was reliving the first time I had ever laid eyes on my sweet little Danny. I felt the soft pressure as his little hand took hold of my finger, and felt that same happiness wash over me. For the briefest of moments, I knew happiness again. I was so enveloped in that warmth that I didn't feel her watching me. "As adorable," she said softly. She was dressed like the nurse that had delivered my Danny, but her eyes were black as coals. I was too shocked to say anything. In an instant, fear had gripped me tight. "I heard your prayers," she continued, gently placing a finger in front of Danny. "I'm afraid he doesn't work that way." I heard Danny giggle as he let go of my thumb and grabbed her index finger. When I finally regained my composure, all I could ask was, "Who are you?" "I'm someone who can help," she spoke, offering a gentle smile. "I was like you once too, not exactly for me. It was my daughter." I felt that same heartbreak that's eating you away every second of the day, that mental minefield that comes with every waking moment, and the monsters that follow you into your dreams. I know what it's like to lose your whole world, Tears had begun to well up in the dark pools of her eyes. I watched the tears silently fall as Danny wrestled with her hand. I want to help you. I want to help you because I know he won't. My eyes narrowed. I knew what she was, I knew where she came from, and what she wanted. And out of everything in that moment, what really scared me was the overwhelming sense of sincerity in her voice. What do you mean he won't help? I croaked finally. Even in the haunting bottomless darkness of her eyes, I saw sincere sadness dance across her face. He never knew how, she whispered. The night I found out the truth was the night I sold my soul. I made her promise to torture the bastard that stole every ounce of happiness away from me. The conditions of the deal were that once I allowed her in, she would be in full control of my body until either we both perished or she was exorcised. She explained that in the event of the latter, although I would be free from her, she wouldn't rest until she found me again. Lastly, she emphasized that my soul would forever be bound to service hell, that I would be disfigured and my spirit branded, unfit for God's compassion and entry into heaven. As far as I was concerned, there was no such thing as his compassion, and hell couldn't be worse than what I had to live through every time. I opened my eyes, I agreed and let her loose, and she would go on to honor our agreement. To the letter I watched as that stain on humanity went through every horror the body would physically allow. I watched for the first time as a soul was dragged and broken in hell from time to time. I still think of it. You're probably thinking it was torture, being trapped with a demon in your body, that once you sign yourself over your subject to the worst punishment imaginable. You'd be wrong. The reason it's so hard to exorcise a demon from a body isn't because they're fighting to stay. It's because we want them to stay. In exchange for your body, they create a reality where you regain everything you lost. To let me live to see a life that was so unjustly taken. I saw my son grow and I died a happy man with my wife alongside me over and over and over. I never knew suffering while I was there. I never knew pain, she explained to me. That those who sought the devil out willingly knew suffering he could never replicate, and that those brave enough to ask for his help would receive it in full, and so much more, that even though God never knew how to help, the devil wouldn't hesitate to try and learn how. The night that priest ripped that demon from my body, God took my life a second time. Ever since then, I've been wandering the streets looking for her. And as I walk those roads, I can hear it. When my soul was freed, I gained something I don't know if it's an extra sense or something that's always been there. Now I can hear them in every home, across every alley and every street all over the world. I hear those desperate prayers for help, prayers almost identical to the ones I sent as I boiled alive in agony those 2 years ago. The suffering pleas of the world are almost as deafening as the silence that echoes back